Oh my goodness, my screen just went crazy. Hold on.
It heard you say that you wanted it to be recorded.
Oh my gosh. My whole screen just, yes, thank you. All right, so how the system works from the L&E committee. Jeff and I will be speaking mostly to this content today, and when we say how the system works, I just want to make clear what it is we're talking about. And so the way this started and what was envisioned is an overview for how the regional water supply system works. And when we, that can also mean a lot of different things. And so the way we've approached this based on guidance from that committee that you heard about at the beginning was to really think about it in terms of summarizing the various supplies that are available to the region, their relative constraints and availabilities to the region. And we start looking at that from a high level and a general sense of availability and constraints. And then to a certain extent, we narrow that down to purveyor levels and really specific for the American River. So that's kind of an overview of what we're trying to capture today and communicate. And just also want to point out that, yes, the committee helped to guide this and provided a lot of input in terms of what we're talking about, but there was also review and input from some of the purveyors and other people within the water forum to really draw on the expertise that exists within this group. So to say that, yeah, it's very much the product of a collaboration between a lot of different experts. Jeff and I will be speaking to it. But as we go through this, if there are detailed questions, we'll do our best to answer it, but there are likely to be people within this group that will be better suited to answer that. And then just the last thing to note is that there is a lot of information in here and it's a lot to cover. So our plan is to include this slide deck as a reference document to you all once we get there are a couple of pieces where we need to get some final numbers from people and individual groups before we release the slide deck, but we'll be providing the slide deck as a piece of as a reference document for the group. And what won't be covered today, but is included in that slide deck is more detailed summary slides for each of the individual purveyors. We're going to talk about the region as a whole. There are slides that break down information at a more specific level. But then there's just within each of those service areas, as we talk about the purveyors, there's so much detail that we could go into that we can't cover in this type of a setting. So we've included summary slides for each purveyor that will be at the end of the slides when they are released. So with that, I'd just like to reiterate Jessica's thanks to the committee and then also just all the other people that provided input and contributions to the content. So how the content, the agenda for today, we'll give a brief, Jessica's going to give an overview in terms of how this session and other sessions like it fit within the Water Forum 2.0 process and why we felt it was important to go over this with the group. And then Jeff is going to talk through the Upper American River watershed and Folsom Reservoir. And then I will talk through the last three topics of the groundwater system, the municipal water supply system, and then plans for future plans for the water supply reliability. So with that, I will turn it over to Jessica to just give us a good overview.
Thanks, Ashley. So this, just in terms of where this fits in our process in the Water Forum, we've really, let me start here. When I joined the Water Forum and I asked all the Water Forum members, and I forget what meeting it was, but what is it? Why the Water Forum? What brings you here? What's important? And one of the main answers that I kept hearing over and over and over again was, we come here to learn. There's, we're all experts in our own right and, in our own fields. But when we come to the Water Forum, we're always learning something new. And I think that that's a really strong foundation for the work that we're doing here. Not just having that curiosity, but also an awareness that, it's important to come at these incredibly complex issues, not just from our own area of expertise, but also with a curiosity about other disciplines and how we solve complex problems with a multidisciplinary approach. And so that I think is an important foundation for the water forum overall, but very, very important for this process in water forum 2.0, as we dig in collectively to an understanding of our system and how the system works. We're going to be talking about that physical infrastructure today. And then as we continue through the water forum process this year and into next, we're going to be talking about other aspects of the system, whether that's river health and conditions, groundwater. There are other topics that for sure will be coming up in phase 3 and phase 4. So, this is really, we started the water forum 2.0 process, the foundational work with those educational briefings. And I think that, the learning and engagement continues. So one other, here we are, learning engagement. I think one other piece of it too, I was going back and listening to some of the foundational briefings from the start of the process. And one thing that really struck me was, one, the presentations are just very condensed information, and it's nice to be able to go back and review it. But the other piece that's really important is the conversation and the questions that happen and the discussion that happen after the presentation, or as a part of the presentation. And the perspectives that are brought forward, the additional pieces of information that are brought in from the plenary members are just, they're just little jewels. They're really little nuggets. And so I invite you all to really focus in on this presentation, put all your stuff aside, close your email. The world is a distracting place. And really, let's dig in here, write down your questions and your curiosities and the insights that you're having. And, let's this is a discussion not just for today, but it's one that we can look back on and really use as a reference point and a way to understand how the system works and how we're thinking about it.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, and just to reiterate, I think what you said too is just that the part of what this helps to serve is to give everybody a common foundation of understanding as we go into these different phases of the water forum 2.0 and having informed negotiations when we talk about different options for the water supply system, and so that we can have this general understanding of what those options might be. Does anybody have the LNE committee or anybody else have anything they'd like to ask or add before we jump into the content? Are we good?
Hey, Ashley, this is Jim Ray. I just wanted to acknowledge both Mike Grinstad from the Sacramento County Water Agency, as well as Rob Schwartz from RWA. They were huge contributors, and they're not here this morning to get acknowledgements, but I think they were incredibly helpful.
Yes, agreed. Thank you. Okay. All right. Then I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to give you an overview of the Upper American River watershed.
Yeah, sure. And so, we probably, people have been in a lot of our meetings. You've heard us talk a lot, particularly about, where the inflows to Folsom Reservoir come from, whatever our different water supply sources are. And so this first thing want to talk about is how our upstream of Folsom Reservoir is really regulated. And so we have several upstream projects, and we've kind of listed them here by their FERC licenses, but certainly these are operated for hydropower, operated for water supply, and so they're we're using the FERC as a kind of convenient bin to put them in. But so
what is FERC?
Oh, I'm sorry, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So that all the hydropower projects are regulated through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and so that all these projects have a license that they operate to provide, they'll constrain and provide regulation to their projects.
Thanks.
Sorry about that. Yep. So we have on the North and Middle Fork, we have the Middle Fork project, mostly in the Middle Fork, I guess. That's PCWA's project. And then we have SMUD's project that is on the Silver Fork of the, or Silver Creek, is a tributary to the South Fork American. And then EID's project 184 is on the South Fork American, up near the top of the watershed. Then there's a lot of the watershed that's unregulated. So on this figure on the right here, you can see the heavy black line out delineates the overall American River watershed. And then we see those 3 projects shaded within the watershed. And then the rest of it is really unregulated. But if you look at this table in the bottom, I've went through and looked at 2016 to 2021, that total average annual Folsom inflow was a little over 3 million acre feet. And between those 3 projects, they regulate about 95% of the inflow to Folsom Reservoir. And there's, in addition to that, the PG&E Drum Spalding project, which is generally on the South Yuba River. Inflows come from that project, and PG&E operates that for hydropower. They do provide some water supply to PCWA, but also that at the downstream end of that project, it goes to their Newcastle powerhouse, which discharges basically into Folsom Reservoir. And you see that, while that's operated for hydropower, at least within this period of record here, that contributed about 1% of the inflow to Folsom. And then that unregulated inflows kind of amounted to the other, the remaining 4%. I think that the PCWA's contribution might include the North Fork. I think that 58% that we see there may be downstream of the confluence of those 2. But generally we see that the vast majority of the inflows to the Folsom Reservoir are regulated and controlled by those other projects.
Hey, Jeff,
Sure.
could I just make one comment?
Yep.
This is really cool, and I love the graphic, super helpful, along with this table. And this may be included in your numbers, but I did just want to point out that on EID's permit 211, not permit 212, excuse me, the project 184 hydropower system, you have it shown there as you said, in the upper watershed of the South Fork, or I'm sorry, the South Fork American, Caples, Silver, Lake Aloha. EID under its license does import water from the upper Truckee River Basin, from Echo Lake. That's shown on your map there, down there at the bottom, Echo Lake. It's not a ton of water, but maybe a couple thousand acre feet. I can't quite remember, but we do bring some water over into the American River watershed. I just wanted to make a note of that.
Appreciate that. And so so the numbers here for the North Middle Fork, that is taken below the American River Pump Station. The South Fork is at the chili bar gauge. So you see the chili bar down there. And so theoretically those imports from Echo would be represented in that inflow to Folsom Lake. This figure here, I had our GIS team here at HDR put this together, and I cut off, and Brian, I hope you don't object to this. I cut off the EIDs at Kybers, because I think downstream from there, I don't think you do any regulation really of the South Fork American.
Brian, no doubt the state of Nevada still begrudges your diversions.
Yes, actually, it's the Kirkwood Ski Resort that begrudges our diversions at Caples.
Can you real quickly
I'm thinking
Jeff,
Echo.
explain that 3,000 that's in the middle of the far right column, the 3,002?
Oh, that's the total combined. If we added up that 1834 and 1166, that is up to 3,000,002. So that's when I talked about the 95%. That's 95% of the 3.1 at the top is the total Folsom inflow for 2016, 2021 average annual. And the 3 million, that number is the sum of the American River or North Fork at below the American River pump station, the South Fork at Chili Bar.
Thanks.
All right, let's go on to the next project. Okay, so we're going to go through real quick highlights of each of these different projects. And so this information is very, very high level. And I hazard to say that there is more information available than anyone probably really wants as part of these FERC licenses. The FERC license applications and documentation literally generates tens of thousands of pages of reports. And so probably we can do is when we release the final ones, we can provide links to each of these different websites or the websites for each project, and people can get more information. But this is the PCWA's project. This is shows their facilities, their reservoirs, tunnels, powerhouses. They have two main reservoirs, the French Meadows and Hellhole, combined for about 344,000 acre-feet of storage. But in addition to that, they have 5 tunnels and 5 powerhouses. And there's probably some more smaller facilities that I didn't count. But this is, this is gives you a snapshot and a high level summary of their project. Let's go on to the next one. Here's SMUD's project, the UARP. And so you can see they do have several reservoirs that are actually in the Rubicon Reservoir, Rubicon watershed, which flows into the Middle Fork. So that would be Gurley, Loon Lake, Buck Island, and Rubicon reservoirs up in the very, very top. And those are connected via a tunnel into Union Valley, which flows into the Silver Creek, which then, like I said, is a tributary to the South Fork American. So the UARP has quite a few reservoirs, almost 400,000 acre-feet of total storage. And in addition, there's 10 tunnels that move water around and 7 powerhouses. So pretty expansive project. And then last we have the project 184. And so as Brian said, they have Echo, which is in the Truckee River watershed, but it connects via tunnel into the South Fork American. And then Aloha, Cables, and Silver are their main regulatory reservoirs. And then you can see that they do have other pertinences downstream from there. They take water at the El Dorado Diversion Dam into their canal, and then that water discharges back to the American down at the El Dorado Powerhouse down near the right where Silver Creek comes in. So, and then this is the I've tried to capture a snapshot of the PG&E project. Again, this project is very modest inflows to the American River. It does provide around 100,000 acre-feet per year of water supply to PCWA. I found that the 2020 imports were just over, just shy of 98,000 acre-feet. This is collectively the PG&E's Drum Spalding project and NID's Yuba Bear project is collectively the most complicated FERC projects in the country. There's a lot of reservoirs, tunnels, and this is just the PG&E side. There's equal number on the NID side. And so those two projects combine to provide a small amount of water that goes directly into Folsom Reservoir via the Newcastle Powerhouse. And then they provide some water. PG&E provides supplies to PCWA. So I'll stop there. Any questions or comments about these? You can see this figure here. The purple reservoirs are the NID facilities, and the red are the PG&E. So they're very interlaced and interconnected. But any other questions about these projects that I've talked about so far? Upper watershed. All right, let's move along. So Folsom Reservoir. All right, so we know, okay, so Folsom Reservoir is part of the Central Valley Project. The Folsom unit, more specifically the Folsom unit, and the Folsom Dam was constructed in 1955. The Folsom unit includes the Folsom Powerhouse, Folsom Dam, actually Folsom South Canal may not technically be part of the Folsom unit. We included it as part of the list here. But Lake Natoma, the Nimbus Dam, Nimbus Power Plant, and the Nimbus Fish Hatchery make up the Folsom unit of the Central Valley project. Central Valley project in the north of the Delta primarily includes Trinity, Shasta, and Folsom. Operates to provide water supply, flood protection, and fish and wildlife protections. And then the whole, I'll have a subsequent slide about the CVP and the Delta and others, but nominally here that Folsom itself has 967,000 acre feet of gross capacity. That's the storage capacity. And then there are also M&I intakes for Folsom, San Juan, Roseville, and EID that come out of Folsom Reservoir. So overall CVP, this is just a brief summary of some of their contracts and contract types. There are, you can see on the right here, there's a lot of different shading. And this is a map from the CVP. I will add a disclaimer that kind of oversimplifies some of the contract types. And not all of the contracts, you can see there's a hatched region there for the Sacramento region, and not all of they're classified as water service contracts, but just to be clear that not all of the contracts within the Sacramento region are water service contracts. Like for example, the city has a settlement contract that's different than the other settlement contracts within the region or within the Sac Valley, but there are different contract types. But overall, broken down some of the different types of contracts that the CVP has. They have 270 contracts total throughout the Central Valley, and those come to a combined 9.5 million acre feet. So along the Sacramento River, we have the settlement contracts, which are generally those are water users that had senior water rights to the construction of the Central Valley project. And so as part of the construction of Shasta Dam, they entered in settlement contracts with the reclamation for their water supply. So they have a historical water use of around 1.8 million acre feet, just shy of that. There's also water service contracts in Central Valley. Then we have the M&I contracts in the American River. You can see the table here. The M&I contracts and historical usage, I think the M&I contract value there is that kind of the paper version of it, but the historical usage is around 180. And so that does leave room for growth and for, there is water that has not been previously delivered under those contracts, but that's the contract quantity. Then there are refuges also in the Sacramento Valley that have their own, they get water supply. And then south of the Delta, there's exchange contractors, which also are senior water rights that senior to the Central Valley project. And so they get water at a higher reliability than the water service contract and refuges in the San Joaquin Valley or south of the Delta. So that's, again, this is a very, very high level summary. That unfortunately they are way more complicated than just this, but this is trying to summarize that. Any questions about any of this information so far?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't catch the acronym SOD.
South of Delta. So that's people, the water users who receive water that's pumped out of the South Delta. That does exclude the Friant Division, which gets their water from Friant Reservoir and is kind of disconnected from the main Central Valley project.
Got it, thanks.
Paul, you had a question?
Yeah, sorry if I missed it, but you have Sacramento River settlement contracts, and then you have American River M&I contracts. Does the M&I contract category here include the settlement contracts that we have on the American River, or is that in the next item down?
No, the settlement contracts, I think those are the Sacramento River one. This is information from Reclamation's websites and the way they've aggregated it. So it was hard to tease out all the details of these things. I don't believe, like I said before, that the American River region has other contracts besides just pure M&I. I think for purposes of this table, all the different American River contract types are lumped into that value. I believe, I'm not positive. I think that the Sacramento River settlement contracts, I think, are the ones up further north along the Central Sacramento Valley. I'm not 100% confident though that, again, pull this data from CBP reports.
That's correct, Jeff. They historically have not thought of the American River settlement contracts as settlement contracts, although they are.
Right.
Jeff,
And then,
one more question. Sacramento River settlement contracts and Sacramento Valley WSC, is
Water service
that also
contracts.
water service contracts? Okay, and what's the difference in a few words?
Yeah, well, basically that the settlement contractors have higher priority. They had senior water rights to the Central Valley project. The water service contracts receive water, water supply provided by, they would not have otherwise had water supply, or they have junior water rights. And so they entered into contract with reclamation to receive water supply.
Ron, you're on mute, Ron. I think you're.
I was going to say they could receive, just hypothetically, they could receive a 0% supply, while the Sac Valley settlement contractors could receive a 75% supply.
Or 18%.
So, well, 18%. Yeah, right. But technically their contracts don't permit a shortage greater than 25%.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. The water service contractors are subject to water availability. The settlement contracts are technically limited to water inflows to Shasta Reservoir, and it's either 100% or down to 75%.
Well, the main difference between the two is the water service contracts represent CVP supplies that were developed and generated by the Central Valley project. Whereas the Sac River settlement contracts and the American River settlement contracts represent underlying water rights holders. So they have priority over the projects.
I just also wanted to, in case people on the call aren't as aware of what happened this year, the reason Ron and Jeff were pointing out the difference between 25% and 18% was that their contract previously said they wouldn't go below 25, but because this year was so extreme with the storage and CVP, they did reduce them down to 18%.
Actually, flipping that around, their contracts say that they wouldn't receive less than 75%, and this year they got 13%.
Yes, thank you.
So
And the reason why they had to cut the contracts this year is actually because of the Endangered Species Act. So
Right.
to avoid Section 9 liability for taking the fish in the Shasta system, they had to cut in order to develop an appropriate cold water pool.
Yes, thank you.
And I do want to note that there is a state water project that runs in parallel. Oroville, for example, is part of the state water project. So it operates in parallel, and there are some combined objectives between the Central Valley project and state water project, but they are technically two distinct projects with separate contracts. And we don't really have much information about the state water project here.
But the Feather River settlement contractors have, I guess, around 1 million acre feet of settlement contracts.
That's correct. I
So
think it's a little south of that, but yeah, generally close to nearly 1 million acre feet.
that represents a lot of water.
Mhm.
And they have a much higher delivery reliability, short of acts of God, than the state water project south of Delta, and for that matter, north of Delta, urban and ag contractors.
Correct.
Okay.
All right, should we go on?
Yep, and I was just gonna, oh, go ahead, Chris.
One quick question. I thought, and maybe I just misheard you, that you said the total amount of water delivered from CVP was 5.9 billion acre
9.5.
feet.
9.5 is total amount of contract. amounts.
9.5.
That's not necessarily how much is delivered. That's how much they have in contracts.
Got it.
And I believe that includes the Bryant division as well.
It does.
All right. So that's
includes
not all
Ryan.
on this chart then. That's not all. on the
Correct.
table.
Correct.
Got it. All right. So where can you just direct me to where would I go to see that whole list?
Yeah, sure. We'll pull, we're starting to pull some references together. And so we'll, if you do a search on the Central Valley Operations, Bureau of Reclamation Central Valley Operations website, they do have some information there about the contracts and historical deliveries. We're working on a library that we'll try to make available to people. And that would include some of those historical contract deliveries.
Thanks.
I was just going to add, as we go through this, within each of these slides, there's a lot of information and there's a lot of detail. So I think it's good we ask questions and get clarity where we need clarity. But just remembering that there's still a lot to go, and our intention is to get, like in this instance, talking about Folsom Reservoir and the CVP, giving an like we said at the beginning, giving an overview of the supplies available to the region and the relative constraints and availability of each of them. So, and that was the intention with this slide, is that the Folsom is operated as part of this broader CVP. Their different water supply contracts are part of what drives them and their operations and the decisions they make. And there's other factors as well, which Jeff will speak to now.
Yeah, well, and real quick, I just wanted last little thing to add on here is that there is a very prescriptive priority of how the water is delivered. You know, the agricultural water service contracts are generally lower priority than the M&I contracts. You know, the settlement contracts are highest priority. I think that the refuges, and Jenny or Ron or someone else probably can correct me on this, the refuges have a similar type of priority to M&I contracts.
No, they're with the settlement contracts, and
Okay.
they are cut at the same rates.
Okay, so the refuges have higher priority then. Okay, and then theoretically, I believe that the South of Delta and Sacramento Valley water service contractors are similar allocations, but I think other factors can limit their deliveries besides water availability.
Yeah, geographic realities sometimes mean that North State deliveries are higher than
That's right.
South State. Unless that peripheral canal is built.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. So the Delta, and this is kind of it picks up right where Ron left off there. But just to give a little geographic context, I got the American River is up at the very top of the screen there on the top right corner. Sacramento River flows into the North Delta. You have San Joaquin River flows in from the bottom right corner. All of our exports are, well, not all of them, I should say. The majority of the exports come from that circled area. And then the Delta outflow is as water flows out to the bay. So the Delta is kind of the hub of California water, and Mr. Helliker can speak much more eloquently about D1641 than I can, but it's currently the governing state board document that is included in DWR and Reclamation's water rights for the Delta. And so this decision 1641 includes within the Delta, among many other things, several requirements for water quality. And we'll hear a lot about how Folsom is being operated to meet water quality requirements. So generally the travel time from Folsom Reservoir to the Delta is about a day, whereas it's about a week from Shasta. So often what we hear about Folsom being referred to as a first responder, that's just because its proximity, the water can get to the Delta quicker. If there's something unexpected occurs and they need to get water and improve water quality conditions quickly, they can release water from Folsom and have it get to the Delta within a day. Theoretically, they would start releasing from Shasta around the same time and then back off on Folsom when that water gets to the Delta. We don't see that generally occur in practice, but that's the theory of how Delta water quality could be managed by the Central Valley Project. But within D1641, there are chloride standards. That's for Contra Costa Water District. They have a separate export. They have several separate export locations from within the Delta. There's also electroconductivity, that is a metric that's often used for agricultural water quality. Electroconductivity is also used for fisheries. And then there's a delta outflow standard. And then you'll hear a lot about a term called X2. And X2 is actually a distance from the Golden Gate Bridge to a particular water quality parameter. And I'm always mess it up, so I'm not even going to try. But basically, a larger number means that the water quality, that the parameter that has pushed further into the Sacramento Valley or Sacramento River, and would indicate lower quality water, higher salinity water within this up into the delta, whereas a low number would indicate that the water is fresh further out into the delta, so that the distance from the Golden Gate Bridge for those water quality constituents is further out. So the D1641 includes February to June X2, but there's also biological opinions. And so one of the major ones, NIMS also has biological opinions. I just grabbed the Fish and Wildlife Service one here because of delta smelt are a big area of concern within the delta. There's other fisheries as well, but amongst the many different elements within the Fish and Wildlife Service BIOP, we have Old and Middle River flows. Old and Middle River flows are two north-south rivers that flow. You can't see my pointer, but kind of north of the export pumps, and north-south from there. Those two trips. That's I think the Old River that Ashley was just flashing along. Then just to the east is the Middle River, and so those two rivers would normally, in a historical context, flow north and kind of westward, but due to the export pumps, those actually flow southward. So there are some limitations in the BIOPS about how much negative flow that can be in the Old and Middle River flow, and that's just to try to avoid having too badly disturbed hydrodynamics within the delta. Also, there's a delta outflow parameter. And then currently there's a fall X2. And so, yeah, so all these little dots and triangles within the figure on the right, this is just from a document called the Delta Atlas. It's publicly available, but those dots and triangles represent different water quality monitoring locations. Not necessarily the standard locations, but just to show that they do monitor delta water quality in quite a few places. Any questions or comments, amendments to what I had there? Cool. All right. Now we'll get a little bit more specific about some decisions that directly affect the American River and Folsom Reservoir. So decision 893 was a pretty major one. That was 1958. And this was kind of this really settled out the water rights permits for the city of Sacramento and the Bureau of Reclamation. They both applied for water rights around the same time. And so decision 893 really controls or governs how those water rights interact with each other. And so city of Sacramento, decision 893, decision 893 is part of all three water rights, both the direct diversions for the city. The city also has water rights for water stored within the SMUD reservoirs. And then Bureau of Reclamation has water rights for both diversions and diversions to storage. And so decision 893 establishes standards and is kind of the settlement of those water right applications. Within decision 893, there is a standard for flows in the American River. These are generally accounted for at the mouth. They're not specified, but we always assume that this is the flow that has to be throughout the American River, lower American River, and including down below all the diversions and out at the mouth. And you can see that they're quite low. And so I think that they are seen as being inadequate, but they do form a floor that's separate from any sort of other standard that's been established to date. Let's go on to the next slide. So Hodge is another major, we hear a lot about Hodge. And so what is Hodge? so the Hodge decision was in 1987, and it was actually specifically in reference to East Bay Mud's application to get water supply from Folsom South Canal. And as you can expect, that there was some opposition in the American River region against the East Bay Mud taking water from Folsom South Canal. So the Hodge decision came out and it limited how that water could be taken. And so you can see the standards that are established in the kind of tabular form here. And it basically said that East Bay Mud could take that water if under these criteria. Now, these have been applied also to the city of Sacramento and their Fairbairn expansion. And so basically said that if the Hodge criteria are being met, then these diversion rates are allowed at, or if the Hodge criteria are not being met, I should say, then these diversion criteria apply. And that's kind of pre-expansion at Fairbairn. If the Hodge criteria are exceeded, then the city can take their full allotment or the full capacity at Fairbairn. And then this is included in, I believe this amends the city's water right, and this is part of their water forum agreement. Any other comments about that?
Of course, just for some historical context, the Hodge decision ultimately was the reason that the County of Sacramento and East Bay Municipal Utility District decided to build the Freeport facility and use that facility to deliver water to Zone 40 and the East Bay Mud service area.
Glad you brought that up, Ron. Let's go next slide. So the Freeport project is as a result of the Hodge agreement, the city, or excuse me, Sac County Water Agency and East Bay Mud partnered to construct the Freeport project. And so they have an intake off the Sacramento River down south of the American, and that water provides water supply to the Zone 40 for Sac County Water Agency, goes to the Vineyard treatment plant. And then also that water is conveyed over to the Folsom South Canal and then taken down into East Bay Mud system. It's it's a shared facility, and you can see here some of the capacities that they have. And then, like I said, Vineyard was built to take advantage of Freeport. And Clyde, do you have a question?
I was just going to clarify here, just kind of, because this was a fairly important piece. EB Mud had a contract for 150,000 acre feet of water that they would divert from Nimbus Reservoir, and it's on this chart here, and they would take it south down all the way down to Stockton, which is shown here and attached into the McCollum River Aqueduct. And the fight, which went on for a very, very long time, and there was a lot of shouting across the table, EB Mud versus Sacramento interests. And the Sacramento interests wanted the water to continue to flow down the lower American River. And EB Mud said, wave there. We have a contract, we have a contract, we have a contract. And the resolution of all of this was the Freeport project. And I just note that, so this kept, the Freeport project kept the water in the lower American River, and the River Arc project, which PCWA, the county, the city, and one of the other private companies is looking to build a similar project on the north side of the river out by the big airport, and also which would also leave water in the lower American River and instead divert water from Sacramento. But that was a very, very big fight. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Clyde. All right, let's anything else about Freeport? All right, let's move along. Oh, sorry, Rob.
Yeah, I have a question. Are the Hodge criteria still relevant given the Freeport project's construction?
Yes, they are. They are, particularly as it affects Fairbairn. So okay. Fairbairn is still holding, and there are, yeah, so that does affect the city in several different ways. These diversion rates here are applicable to Fairbairn. Also, part of the water forum agreement includes some Hodge related provisions.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know, Brett, if you want to say anything about that. No? Okay.
I think you covered it very nicely. Thank you.
All right. All right, let's keep going, Ashley. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how Folsom Reservoir is generally operated. So there is a seasonal kind of pattern to how the Folsom Reservoir is operated. These Central Valley Project requirements are always an underlying that it's always an obligation that's as part of the Central Valley Project. Folsom Reservoir has to provide water for to meet the Central Valley Project obligations. Generally, what we see is that there's releases from go up in the summer. In winter, it's generally in trying to keep flows down as much as possible or manage for floods. So what we see here on the right, I've put together two figures which kind of show kind of comparison of how Folsom Reservoir operations have changed through time. So the upper figure is the median flows for different time periods. So the blue line is before the construction of Folsom Dam, back to 1904. This is flows in the American River at the Fair Oaks gauge. And so you can see that hydrograph went pretty high in April, May. That's all that snow melt coming down, and then dropped down to really low levels during the summer. The orange line is, I would call kind of that's pre D1641. There were other Delta water quality controls or requirements, but generally not under the current standard. And yeah, Brian has a good point there that Folsom was originally a flood control facility. And you can see the effect there. You can see how that big on average, on median, I should say, quite high flows in April, May. So Folsom is designed to take advantage of that. And then so pre D1641, pre water forum agreement, there was the operations were slightly different. You can see that a little bit higher flows in February, March, and then the gray is kind of generally our current operational paradigm. There have been some changes to it over time, but generally that's the most recent period, that gray line. And so you can see that we do have that kind of the highest flow of the year is in July, and then kind of stable through the winter. And so that's been the recent historical record. The lower figure shows the minimum flows. Now I'll talk about these really quickly. I know there's been some questions about the maximum flows, but on the minimum flows, you can see there that we've shifted the hydrograph later into the year. And so by that I mean that we used to see that the minimum flows were, this is like the all-time minimum flow, and that went to around 1400 CFS in May. Now we've pushed that minimum further later into the year. Now we see the minimum occurring in June, or the peak minimum pre D1641, pre water forum agreement, and now we see that minimum is occurring well, it's still in June, but it's gone up under the current operations. Other thing of note is that pre Folsom Dam, you can see how low the flows got in the river in the summer, and theoretically any fish in the river would be upstream of where the dams are. But the flows in the lower American River historically have gotten quite low. And you can even see on the upper figure that the median flows were pretty low in August and September. The reason I didn't include maximum flows is that maximum flows are subject to the major floods. That's the big driver there. And really our big floods of records, 86 and 97 have been really dominating that. And so there hasn't, 1904 to 1955, there, and Gary will probably correct me on this. There were a couple of major floods in there, but really the big dominating ones, 86 and 97, that's not really affected by the same temporal way that this is broken down here. And happy to have further discussion about how floods have changed in the river through time, but the maximum flows weren't really as interesting as looking at the minimum and medians. note that, as we have noted here on this, that the scales are different between these two figures. If we had, limited the lower figure to 9,000, some of the subtleties would have been wiped out. So we did want to show the different scales in the two different figures. Any questions about this, Clyde? Is that an old hand or is that a new hand? I don't think that's an old hand. Okay. Should we go next figure? All right, so our MRRs. This is something that we've much more recent, and hopefully folks have heard about this over time. But so we developed what we called there is the original water forum agreement spoke to a flow standard, and that went through several iterations. We had a most recent one, and this is what's included in the current biological opinions, or a version of this is included in the current biological opinions, is what's called here the 2017 modified FMS or MFMS. And the big things that the MFMS includes are minimum release requirements, that's Nimbus or Natoma Reservoir, Nimbus Dam release requirements. And those are designed to be protective of different species during different times of the year. And so you can see on the right here, some of those the different temporal aspects of how those MRRs affect different fisheries. And then we also include some other, the modified FMS includes also some other elements to protect reds from being dewatered. Reds are the nests that the fish build when they're laying their eggs. Also includes temperature management standards. And then we included Folsom Reservoir storage targets, objectives in May and December. And those have been incorporated. Okay, there you go. Yep. So the BIOP included the MRRs, temperature standards, and then we have a MOU. The water forum has an MOU with reclamation for the December storage objective. And you can see this little figure in the bottom right shows kind of the bounds on what those MRRs are. You can see that we have a 500 CFS minimum throughout the year, and then the upper limit of the MRR kind of ranges. It's 1,500 in some months and goes up as high as 2,000 in November, December. All right, any questions or comments about this? Let's move along. What's next? I think next.
Sorry, there was one other comment I think we wanted to make, and just referencing back to that D893 and what those minimum flows were, and the improvement that this makes in establishing that floor. It's just one last thing.
Good catch. Thank you. Okay, so our this is the latest water control manual, and I know that Gary gave a presentation a couple months ago about flood management at Folsom Reservoir. But basically, there is a period between beginning of October and beginning of June where there is a limit on how much water can be stored within Folsom Reservoir. And we call that the flood pool. The rest of the year, the water that's available for release for other uses is that we call that the conservation pool. And so you can see how that changes through time. Now this curve, this heavy dark line, the top of conservation as we call it, that's based upon analysis of historical floods and when the timing of runoff and how much space we need to leave in the reservoir to capture any major events that might come in. This is based upon the new latest and greatest water control manual that was just finalized and adopted in 2019, and it does reflect the new spillway that was constructed in 2017. That new spillway is really what makes this possible. The operations of this new water control manual had several different objectives. You can see them bulleted down below here, but really it's trying to, these were some of the objectives that were set out for the water control manual to demonstrate that it could be managed. And so getting that 1 in 100 year down to 115,000 CFS That was a major objective. The 1 and 200 down to 117. For some reason I thought that was a bigger number, but I think Gary provided some edits to this. So yeah, it's trying to provide that flood safety for the Sacramento region.
Good morning.
Keep those flows down to manageable numbers.
Hello.
Kyle, you question?
Hey, I was just touching base with you because
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yep. So this is a little bit of a diagram of Folsom's flood capacity, flood appurtenances. So this is a great figure here provided by Gary and the core that kind of shows a schematic of how the new gates, this is the purple gates on the right, joint federal project, and this is a nice figure of it here on the left. And those gates are much lower elevations. And so what that allows is for increased releases before the reservoir gets up high into the storage. So that allows for more pre-release ahead of the big events. And you can see here that there's a line at the 400 feet. So that's not in volume there, but basically this creates additional release capacity at lower elevations and allows the operators and to get ahead of the big storm events, and lets us, frankly, it lets us keep the storage higher in the reservoir during other times of the year. If you go back a slide, Ashley. Yep, so this one, that variable flood control space down below at the bottom end of that flood control diagram, that is, there are rules for how that space gets used based upon forecasted inflows, and really that having that additional capacity of those gates allows for that storage to be kept up at that 400,000 acre feet, that 400,000 acre feet of empty space. That's a 567. And by having that additional capacity, lets us keep Folsom Reservoir up higher, because we know we can release the water to get down if needed ahead of the big events. And that's what those new gates allow for. And there's also been levee improvements along the lower American River to allow for those higher flows, not to create any damages. The last thing, you might hear a little bit real quickly on this, that there is a project going on right now looking at, there's an authorization, and Gary, you're going to have to correct me on this one, but there's authorization to do a small dam raise, and that would increase that surcharge space on the top of the dam. It's not allocated for storage, but the idea would be that creates a little more surcharge space and lets the dam handle the really big events better. And it would allow the reservoir to, if you can't get the water out through the gates, can't control it at a manageable level, it creates a little bit additional storage for it, for that water to hold it in the reservoir. All right, let's go on. All right, Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so yeah, that's the end of the Folsom Reservoir section. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we leave that? I think we've gotten a lot of good ones throughout the slides, but just to make sure. Okay. So again, the intention with that information and all of the great detail that we had about Folsom Reservoir is to just give that indication of how it's operated, how that impacts the regional water supply, availability, and just general conditions of that resource. So similarly, we'd like to give you an overview of the groundwater system. So to start, I think most people in this group are aware that in 2014, SGMA was passed, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and the charge of that is that the Bulletin 118 groundwater basins, as defined by DWR, are charged with developing these groundwater sustainability plans, and that responsibility falls on the GSAs. And so what this map on the right is showing are the three Bulletin 118 subbasins within our region. So we have the North American subbasin, the South American subbasin, and the Cosumnes subbasin. And then each of the respective GSAs within those basins. And all three of these subbasins relied on a tool called COSANA, which is a regional groundwater model, in developing their GSPs. And so a lot of the material you're going to see in this section is pulled from that, and that source that we referenced is stated here. And this is a technical appendix that I believe was included as an attachment to all 3 GSPs. So I'll speak to that more in a moment, but just to start off with that, the sustainable yield, each respective sustainable yield for the subbasins are provided here with the North American at around 330,000 acre feet, South American 230, and Casumas 125. So a regional total of just short of 700,000 acre feet. And just for anybody who's not completely well-versed or familiar, what sustainable yield is reflective of is the amount of groundwater that can be extracted from the basin to not compromise the sustainability. So not having detrimental impacts to the ecosystems, to groundwater quality, groundwater levels. There's different thresholds that are established within the Sigma framework to be monitoring and verifying that there aren't detrimental impacts. So that is what that is speaking to. So Jim, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, Jim, you're still on mute. We can't hear you.
Is that an average annual sustainable yield, or is that a maximum for any given year?
That is, I'd say that's it's an annual. That's an annual sustainable yield. So yes, that some years would be higher, some years would be lower, but as terms of a long-term average, that's what, well, an average, that's what that would be. And these numbers were provided by Rob Schwartz. And so another point is that how that is calculated, how that sustainable yield is estimated is dependent on the tools that you use and the assumptions you make. So this is an estimate. There's uncertainty in different aspects of that water balance for the groundwater basin. And so this, he feels, based on his tools and data, is a reflection of now, of current conditions and the sustainable yield within those basins. And so building off of that, looking at the recent period and looking at the estimated average annual change within each of the basins from 1995 to 2018, this provides that average annual change in storage across the region for each of the basins. And so what you see is that the North American's been gaining about 26,000 acre feet per year, South American gaining again between 5,000 and 6,000 acre feet per year. And then the Casumas, though, showed an overdraft for that same period, 1995 to 2018. And again, yeah, that's an average for that time period. And it's an estimate based on the COSANA tool, that tool and the data used to build that tool. And the point I'd like to make there is that while the regional total is 26,000 acre feet of gain in this time period, that I think everybody can appreciate that the boundaries between these subbasins are not geologic, that they're hydrologic, that they're separated by, in this case, rivers, the American River and the Casumas River, and that that's not a barrier to flow. And so conditions across the region are not isolated. And so while you can have gaining in one part, if you're losing in another part, that's not unrelated, and that over time, if trends continue, that water will flow to the lowest point. And so that could change the trends of the subsurface flow within the region. So it's something, it's not insignificant for the other parts of the basins. And the other point I wanted to make, I see you, Tim, is that estimate is for a specific time period. And as I said, each of the GSPs did use the COSANA tool for their water balances and their water budgets, but they did use different periods of record to come up with their estimated average annual change in storage. And so pulling directly from the GSPs and their individual base periods that they referenced, these are the trends that they reported within their GSPs. So you can see that the North American used that same base period that I showed on the previous slide. The South American showed slightly higher gains between 2009 and 2018, so a shorter and more recent time period. Casumas used also a slightly shorter time period and not going all the way to 2018, but it showed a greater level of overdraft and almost 12,000 acre feet per year, so double what was shown in 1995 to 2018. So just making sure that everyone is aware that if you're familiar with the GSPs, those numbers are different than what is shown on this slide. So go ahead, Tim.
Ashley, is it possible that a groundwater purveyor in one basin through their pumping actions can impact the storage amount in an adjacent basin?
Speaking from a general sense, I would say yes. that they are not unrelated, but I don't want to speak specifically to a purveyor or basin in the region. I know you said Rob's not on the call, but if anybody wants to revise what I just said, please feel free. Chris?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you're going to show groundwater elevations. Not that I want to go deep in the weeds or anything like that, but that can also affect these numbers.
Yeah, I don't have a slide showing the contours for the basin. What I had hoped we could show would be the change in those levels. But we don't have a slide showing the elevations. That's something we can look at later if it's helpful. Any other questions or comments? The next couple of slides we're going to walk through. I'm going to walk through just the recent levels of extraction and the different uses of groundwater in the region. So I will go ahead. So looking at the three kind of categories of extractions that are accounted for within the GSPs, we have urban, agricultural, and remediation. And so what we wanted to do was kind of walk through the relative magnitude and where those extractions are taking place. And so starting with urban, for the 3 subbasins in the region, averaging over that same time period of 208,000 acre feet per year. And you can see where those urban wells are located in relation to the greater subbasin. So a lot heavier level of use in the North American and on the fringes of the South American, but they are obviously in the southern parts of the South American and in the Casumas as well. Looking at agriculture, so if people aren't aware, a lot of the agricultural pumping is not necessarily metered or reported in the same way that M&I pumping might be reported and metered. So looking to location and of extraction for agriculture, you really need to look at land use to try to discern where that's happening. And so the map on the right is showing the land use in the region. And this is a 2015 land use map. I believe it's Rob's not on the call, but I believe it's a compilation of different data sources from DWR, Cropscape, and I think one other one, just to be able to get the full extent, because these surveys are collected at different times, but these are all representative of 2015. But totaling across the region, 430,000 acre feet per year. So more than double the amount of urban pumping in the region. So making sure we want to point that out. And then I know that the land use types are hard to read on the slides, but one area that I think is interesting is the vineyards and the purple and the concentration along the waterways here. So there's acknowledging that the way the tool estimates agricultural water use, there will be surface water supplies used to meet some of those demands, but they do their validation and calibration to make sure they're accounting for which supplies areas are using groundwater or surface water. So I'll keep going. The remediation is the smallest, and what these are related to are contamination plumes within the basins due to previous activities in the region. So thinking of Aerojet, Mather, McClellan, Boeing, and around the rail yard. And so these entities are required to do remediation pumping around those plumes, where they essentially extract groundwater, treat it, and then discharge it back into the waterways to remove, to dilute and try to mitigate the impacts of those plumes. It's a small portion of the groundwater extraction, but it is nonetheless part of it. So total extraction for the region coming to about 660,000 acre feet per year, based on the 1998 to 2018 base period. Okay, any questions on extractions or estimates of change in storage? Okay, so the next slide, just wanted to end with this one for the groundwater section, and that from the statewide perspective, when we think of our region, it is unique, and that in this time period, as we showed looking at those 3 subbasins, as a region, there was gaining groundwater levels, not across the board, but there was gaining groundwater levels. And so this map is from the 2020 update of the Bulletin 118 report, which is a statewide report on groundwater conditions. And what you can see is that looking across the state with the colors indicating these different conditions here, the Sacramento region with this zoomed in insert is really a concentrated hub of gaining groundwater levels Sorry, that's not shown very well, but this is again 1998 to 2018. So that same base period we were looking at for the other slides kind of shows how this region stands out in the state. So that is the end of the groundwater section. But again, the intention is to just give a general overview of the resource and its current conditions. This isn't necessarily looking at what is projected into the future. And the GSPs have done a lot of work for that. And we're also a part of the ad hoc technical team, and we're looking at that as part of that effort. And so that future condition is a topic that we're not talking about today. This is really looking at current and historical trends in groundwater. Any questions or comments? Yeah, Paul?
So to answer Chris's question, there are graphics that show the groundwater elevations and the depth to groundwater, which are very telling, and they tell the same story. And I think they're available in the GSPs or other locations. So one of the things that results from this presentation is that there are a number of resources available that are on the Water Forum SharePoint that you guys have so kindly put all of that data there. So I commend to Chris to review that if he's interested in the details. But the short story here is that this data that you're showing right now reflects a concerted effort by water agencies in Sacramento area to shift from using groundwater to surface water during wet years. And so we've been delivering water to Sacramento Suburban and Cal-Am, which comes from PCWA and from our supplies. And that's resulted in groundwater elevations going up in the SGA area. And the Freeport project, I think, has been the primary driver for the improvements in the SCGA area. So it's a good track record we've been doing for the past 30 years, and we plan to continue to do so.
Clyde?
Yeah, Ashley, could you go back one slide? On the 663,000 acre feet of groundwater, this is all for remediation well. Is this 663,000 acre feet of water going back into the river?
This 24,000 acre feet is the remediation. This is the total
Oh,
for all three. Yeah.
My mistake.
Phew.
Thank you.
Yeah. Rob?
Yeah, two questions. One is looking at that particular table. Do we have any data that indicates to what extent water that is extracted for these different uses is going back into surface waters, and where? And is that relevant? And then the other question relates to, is there any data that suggests that differences in groundwater elevations and changes in groundwater elevations between one basin and another will impact or change the rate of flow from one basin to the other?
So to the first question, in terms of data for that kind of accounting of the fate of the water after it's extracted, I'm by no means an expert. So Jeff, I don't know if you can add more, but I know that for the remediation pumping, there is that detailed accounting in terms of where it's going. Yeah. Agricultural, I would guess there's estimates. There's not, because there will be runoff and deep percolation that ends up going back into the groundwater basin. And that's all part of the broader groundwater model. So it's an estimate. For urban, they have their wastewater discharge plants that would be, and it's not so separated groundwater, surface water. It's just their overall effluent. So yeah, in terms of groundwater specifically, and the pieces of it that end up back in the waterways, the remediation pumping would be the best detailed source.
I think that the COSANA model provides some of those. We could try to dig out what the actual, generally, ET is going to be the loss, evapotranspiration of the water is probably a major loss factor. And so we could, I mean, if that's really an interest, we could, and ET applies both to urban and agricultural water. So if that's really something people want to track down, that's.
But for the American River per se, remediation is really the only source of water that's going back into the American River.
Directly.
Back into the American, that's right.
Yeah.
Ashley, excuse me, for Aerojet's remediation, I used to work for Aerojet and work
Yeah.
alongside their environmental department. Those waters are returned to surface waterways, which flow to the American River primarily, if I recall, through Buffalo Creek. And it's not quite gallon for gallon replacement, but it's pretty darn close.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And then Rob, to your second question in terms of the data associated with the impacts of elevation changes in one subbasin and the impacts to another subbasin. As Jeff said, I think that would be a product of the COSANA modeling. And so that would, if that's an area of interest, I would imagine that's something that we could try to, or we could talk to Rob and see if there's some way to provide an estimate of that, but I don't know that there's something readily available for that.
And additionally, a part of that, Ted, is that flow from one basin to another is based upon a gradient. And so you have a higher gradient, as in one is lower than the other. That's going to create a steeper gradient. You're going to have more flow.
That's
So,
by presumption, yes.
The rate would change.
Yeah. Ted?
Yes, thank you. I was glad to hear that you're looking into future groundwater issues. I would just point out, as we've been talking about the COSANA model, I think all three GSPs have fairly significant suggestions or recommendations and even action plans to both improve modeling and monitoring. And I think that that's an important component to consider. These are numbers based on wells that exist. Some of them have a significant amount of information about them because they are water supply wells. Others do not, or the placement of the wells may not be optimum to protect all of the aspects that the groundwater sustainability plans are charged to do. So I think that's an important aspect when we think about this model. It's a new model. It's based on a lot of information, some of which is highly reliable, and other aspects of it are perhaps not as reliable as we'll want to see in the future.
Thank you, Ted. Greg?
Yeah, I'm really happy to see our success in recharging groundwater basins, but with additional urbanization and climate change, are we trying to see how that might impact things in the future?
Yeah, I would say that, yes. I mean, across the board, I think everybody in this meeting has been involved in some way or another. So yeah, GSPs have done their planning efforts and projections and looking forward to try to anticipate what that will look like and what the impacts on the basins will be. And then as part of the Water Forum 2.0 process and the ad hoc technical team, we're not necessarily looking at the groundwater basins sustainability. But that's another question, is how we're gonna frame that, but looking at the impacts to the regional water supply due to climate change under different scenarios. So yes, this is very much a current retrospective look at where we were and where we have come, and not looking forward at the content of this presentation.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Brett?
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I think, regarding the questions regarding, a source of supply for the American River, I think I'd just offer that while it's not directly a direct supply, folks should keep in mind that many of the agencies have invested in, diversifying their supply for using either surface water or groundwater. So in many cases, when you're switching to your groundwater supply, that has the effect of sort of an in lieu, leaving water in the river. So while it's not directly pumping into the river, it certainly reduces diversions for the suppliers that, have some discretion as to which they're using. In short, to the question about, forecasts, just to reinforce, each of the GSPs included, long-term forecasts in alignment with certain general plans or land use forecasts to anticipate, can we remain sustainable for the future to come. Thanks, Ash.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. All right. Good comments. Thank you, everybody. So that is the end of the groundwater section. And with that, we were going to step into the municipal water supply system. Jessica, I don't know I'm happy to start stepping in if people feel like we want to take a break. I know it's been a lot of information. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe we just take a short break. Everyone can stretch.
Get
Does that
ready.
sound good? Yeah.
There's a lot of yeah.
There's a lot in here. I think we're doing pretty well on time as well.
Yeah.
So how about should we take another 5-minute break? Yep. All right. Let's come back at 11:02.
Thank you.
All right.
See you in a minute.
Okay, bye.
Tony?
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I was trying to let us wrap up and move on, but when we went on break, I thought, I really want to make this comment. I don't think Sac Suburban is here today, and I wanted to compliment them. We were sort of talking about all the gains we've made in conjunctive use, and I really think they're very notable. Through ever since signing the water forum, they've sort of been the example of doing good or committing to conjunctive use. And the records, all these numbers I'm going to say are approximate, so please don't use them for anything, but they've shifted from groundwater to surface water in about 2 out of 3 years in accordance with their water forum commitment. And I think the sum total of the amount of what you might call recharge or banking that they've done over that 20-year period is about 250,000 acre feet. And that comes at a cost. I've always tried to understand how their pro forma looks for that. It's not cheap to shift from groundwater to surface water like they've done. The groundwater basin under their service area has gone up about 10 feet over that same period. And so just really wanted to bring attention to that because I think it is very notable. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And as we go through this municipal water supply system section, we have some information related to conjunctive use. So I can show some numbers related to that, or some figures. Okay. Moving on. Thank you, Paul. I see you answered the question in the chat, so I think that's a good place to do that. Okay, so moving on to the municipal water supply system. Again, so we've spent this time on the Upper American River watershed, Folsom Reservoir, the groundwater system as a way to provide an indication of the relative availability and constraints of these supplies from a higher level. And now we want to walk through the municipal water supply system and talk about how this water is accessed within our region and by who, and just what the relative availability is within our region specifically, and what that looks like and what that's looked like recently. Come on, there we go. Okay, so this is just a really coarse high-level map of the purveyors in the region. Not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just to give it an indication of who's where and relative size. So EID and PCWA kind of on these outer including the upper watershed and the foothills, and then coming down, SCWA and the city being close down here along the southern end of the American River, and then Sac Suburban, San Juan, City of Roseville on the northern side. But just as a reference for anybody that is, we go through this, if you can't remember who's where, just a general picture of what that looks like here. So the first slide to talk through is thinking about surface water entitlements in the form of rights and contracts amongst the purveyors. This information was pulled directly from the Integrated Regional Water Management Plan in 2018. It's a summary of that table. That table includes a lot more detail. And as I said, we'll have the purveyor slides included within this slide deck when it's sent out, which will have more specificity of what the rights are that are summarized here. There's multiple rights and contracts included in this total for each of the purveyors. But just to break it down by American River and Sacramento River. And then what this is showing in the first column is the water rights or contracts for each purveyor. But within that within that allotment of water, they also may have a commitment to others, to some other purveyor entity within or outside of the region. And so that's what this column is highlighting, is where what those commitments are, and then taking that off and including this maximum available by purveyor to indicate for each purveyor and for the region, what's that total entitlement to surface water, in this case, the American River. And the reason they're separated is because if we didn't separate this, there could be double counting, that, you know, if the city of Folsom is getting water from San Juan, that city of Folsom access to San Juan is included in this total, but it's also included in San Juan's total down here. So we don't want to double count. It's taken off here and then summarized here. But so what that's showing is that as a total, the American River entitlements in the region are around 830,000 acre feet per year. And for the Sacramento River, between the city of Sacramento and SCWA, it's about 116,000 acre feet per year. So it's a pretty big number. And we wanted to put that in context with how much has actually been used recently and in general. So looking back to the last 10 years, 2011 to 2021, averaged around 272,000 acre feet per year. So just over a quarter of that entitlement amount, the rights and contracts. And so what this speaks to is that each of these entitlements have their own constraints, whether they're physical or legal. There's reasons why they do not access that full amount every year, and they access some lesser amount, and the different contracts have their own terms in terms of when they're available, under what conditions. So there's a lot of variability. And the result of that is that the total used surface water in the region is around 272,000 acre feet per year. I don't want to spend a lot of time walking through each of the individual purveyors, but that will be included in the reference materials if people are curious about the specifics of individual purveyors. Any questions or comments on that? Or amendments? Okay. So similarly, looking at, oh, go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, a little late finding the button.
That's okay.
If we have just a minor correction, should we send that to you, or who do we send that to?
Yes, you can send it to me. That would be great.
Thank you.
Yeah, and yes, part of why we aren't going to be releasing this, sending out the slides just yet, is we are looking for that feedback and making sure that we have the right numbers. There's a lot of numbers and data included in these slides, and want to make sure everybody has a chance to weigh in and make sure we capture things accurately. So once we get all that feedback from people, we'll send out the slides. Thank you, Paul. Okay. So similarly, looking at pumping, and from the kind of the same lens of what is instead of the entitlement amount, what's the pumping capacity amount? So looking at each of the purveyors' urban water management plans and what their current capacity is. That's this table here is summarizing that. Del Paso Manor, since they don't have an urban water management plan, we just looked at the recent 10-year average of extractions as a surrogate for that capacity. Since it's small in relation to the total, we figured that's okay. But total capacity for the region estimated of around 330,000 acre feet per year. And again, to put that in the context of how much has been used. And again, you'll see these numbers when we looked at like the urban pumping on the groundwater slide. That's that's representing a broader region than when we talk about the water forum purveyors. So this is reflective of these purveyors and the regional use totaling around 120,000 acre feet per year. So about a third of what their stated capacity is. And again, this is purely based on the capacity of their systems. And that's the frame of reference that we're using. Any questions or comments? Okay. And then looking at regional trends and use from a really high level, and then we'll go into more detail. But this is summarizing regional water use and population over a 21-year period. So the purple line is showing that the regional water use, and then the yellow line is showing population. And so the purple line is pretty stable. It dropped down during the 2014 drought. It stayed fairly low, but in the meantime, population has gone up. And so what that results in is this per capita water use indicator, the gallons per capita per day, has been going down. And so water demands have gone down as population has gone up. And that's important as we talk about projections and current uses, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But does anybody have any comments on this slide before I go forward, or questions or thoughts? Okay. So like I said, it's important to remember when we think about current use and projections. This is some information that we wanted to share. This first column is looking at what that 1995 baseline demand was as it was included in the water form agreement. And there's some discrepancies in terms of the water agencies because boundaries have changed and they're not necessarily one for one, but in taking into consideration the region as it was represented and what those demands were estimated to be at the time, where it was around 238,000 acre feet per year. When they were working on the negotiations for the agreement, they came up with what they thought those future demands would be in 2030. And based on that effort, they came up with the number of about 527,000 acre feet. And we wanted to just compare that to what the 2020 actual demands are as reported in the urban water management plan, is like a check to see how were they in their estimates of the demands versus where we are landing now in 2020. And you can see that as that was reported, it was 460,000 acre feet. So, considerably lower than what was anticipated when they were negotiating the agreement. And that's consistent. Well, when you look at the previous slide and you see that population line growing up, it's not that growth hasn't happened to the way they thought it would. It's just that water use has become more efficient in the way that it's used. And so then keeping that in mind, when we look to 2040 projections and what the urban water management plans included for future demands, right now, those estimates are showing around 602,000 acre feet per year. And just wanting to put that out there as a reference for people that those future demands are an estimate and that they can, land on one side or the other of that. Tony?
I can't not comment on this. The number for us shows 104,000 where we committed to 35.5. We're sort of mixing apples and oranges there. The 35.5 is our commitment on the American River diversion, and we have stayed true to that. We haven't exceeded that. The balance of that water has come from our PG&E supply. Just wanted to go on record with that. Thank you.
Yes, and I thank you for pointing that out, Tony. And I know Paul he'll support you on that. There's some discrepancies in the way that the data is summarized in the next several slides and looking at treated and raw water. I'm just so recognizing that, yeah, thank you, Tony, that is not apples to apples, as you said. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, and related to that, I want to make sure everybody understands, because I don't think you mentioned it, but the water forum figures in columns 2 and 3 there, those are surface water diversions, primarily from the American River, but the Sacramento number, for example, includes Sacramento River diversions, I think, too, and the Sacramento County Water Agency. So the 4th and 5th columns are total use, which is includes groundwater. So that's why you see 0 numbers for CalAm Sacramento in the water forum, but 32,000 and 39,000 acre feet for total use.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. All right, any other questions? Okay. So looking at water use in the region from a different angle and wanting to understand the relative supply portfolios of each of the purveyors and their relative magnitude in relationship to each other. This breaks down the purveyors' water use across the region by surface water and groundwater for the last 10 years. And so just trying to illustrate, the city of Sacramento is one of the larger meets one of the larger demands in the region. And then you can see how they kind of line up after that. And Tony, to your point, this PCWA figure is representing the treated water and doesn't include what I heard called as ditch water and untreated water that is delivered within your service area. So that's an important note to make. And then what these pie charts are trying to show, or what they are showing, is the relative composition within the region between surface water and groundwater on average, and then using 2021 as a dry year representative. So trending on average being 30% groundwater, 70% surface water. And then, and that's like in using 2021 as an example, shifting 5% of those supplies to groundwater and 5% less on surface water as that supply becomes more constrained in a dry year. And the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about conjunctive use. But before I do that, does anybody have any questions on this slide? Okay. So looking at, again, that same 10-year period and looking at the composition between surface water and groundwater and using the Sacramento River Index as an indicator of the hydrologic year type is wet, dry, critical, above normal, below normal. These diamonds are showing where that fell in that scale. So looking at 2015 or 2014 as a dry year, you can see that this, as in terms of percentages, the region did shift more supplies to groundwater, and similarly in 2021, if you use that 70% line as kind of the long-term average trend, you can see that in those dry years it drops just slightly below that, and as the region shifts its use of supplies. And I included some individual purveyors that have that capacity to shift supplies more. So I've got 3 here. I know that there are others that have that capacity to some degree, but just wanting to focus on these 3. So first looking at SCWA, Sac County Water Agency in 2014 and as a dry year, and 2017 as a wet year, and looking at how they shifted their supply. So you'll see more groundwater, more surface water in the wet years. Same thing for Sac Suburban, Tony, and saying, indicating that they've done a lot to reduce their groundwater demand when they're able to. So seeing that shift in surface water, a very dramatic shift in the way they allocate their supplies between the dry and the wet year, but going from 100% groundwater to, a third and 2/3. And then Carmichael also being able to deploy that level of flexibility in their supplies. Any questions or comments on this? Okay. So then, this is looking at high level, who has access to what water and how much have they used, looking at how that happens. And we're going to kind of step through this at different levels of detail. So this is the first cut at where those diversions are happening, who's accessing surface water where. So thinking of the upstream diverters as PCWA. And then as Jeff talked about in the Folsom Reservoir section, the Folsom diverters being EID, Folsom, San Juan, and Roseville, pulling water from Folsom Reservoir. The Lower American River, Carmichael, City of Sacramento, SCWA, and then Folsom South Canal, Golden State, and SMUD, and then Sacramento River diverters, the City of Sacramento and Sac County, SCWA. So that's all illustrated here. This is a very helpful graphic that predates Jessica or I, but just as it's not necessarily a map with detailed infrastructure map, but just to give a general indication of where those diversion points are and how much water they're using. Again, similar to the slide I was showing previously with the different magnitudes. We're going to talk through, one of the things that stands out is that you can see Sac Suburban here having surface water and groundwater, but you don't see necessarily where that's coming from. So we'll talk through that on the later slide. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh, thanks, Ashley. Yeah, cool graphic. I just wanted to note that the graphic and the sort of bullets to the left indicate that EID, they sort of seem to imply that EID is taking that, whatever it is, 30-something thousand in 2008 from Folsom. Really only about a third of our supply comes from Folsom. So the 2/3 of it is diverted upstream of Folsom. So I would maybe just, minor point, but add EID as an upstream diverter, since that's really where we get most of our supply.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. And Max?
Yeah, just when this figure gets updated, we may want to think about shifting where East Bay Mud is located, because this gives the impression that we pulled directly from the Freeport facility, when in reality, only Sac County pulls directly off that pipeline. We pull the water through Freeport into the Folsom South Canal, and then we have our own pumping facilities off the Folsom South Canal. And if we want to include any numbers, we now have more drought years where we can show demand, if it's useful to show consumption on here.
Yeah, I think that would be good to show on here, to show that, yeah. Yeah, it is, it's a challenge. I didn't design this, but I know it was a challenge to try to strike that balance of communicating this information in a way that is understandable and simplified, but also not misrepresenting anything. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So like I was saying, well, one other point about this figure is it is showing 2018. Some of the other tables and whatnot that we've shared have been 2020. The reason for 2018 is that it just as a general representative of the average use amongst the purveyors for this 10-year period that we've been looking at was a helpful point of reference. So that's the reason. If people are interested in seeing the 2020, we can provide that also. So as I was saying with the Sac Suburban, this is a good example of, you're looking at this and you can't necessarily see what's happening, how they're getting that water. They don't show a point of diversion, but they do show surface water. One of the areas of interest in this presentation was interties between purveyors. And I think since I've started back in one of those plenaries back in December, there was this discussion of like a subway map being something that would be useful for people to be able to understand where there's connections and how water is moved across the region. So we've spent a lot of time trying to think about how to communicate this. And so starting first at this level, we're going to go through this in two different ways. But this is something that was put together as part of this conjunctive use program operational analysis. And this was an appendix to that, where Rob Schwartz and his team spent time going through with the purveyors data and the infrastructure, getting a map overall for the region of the major transmission lines. So this is not necessarily, these aren't transmission line, this includes transmission lines that serve just the service area, but it also includes transmission lines that cross service areas. And is a good, it's a very detailed and thorough representation of those major infrastructure pipelines within the region. It is not super friendly to look at in a PowerPoint format or even an 8.5 by 11. This is intended to be printed at 36 by 48 inches. So it's a really big, it's meant to be displayed in large format, and you can zoom in to see the pipeline diameters and the details that are pertinent for each facility. Barbara, I see your comment. I can't zoom it in right now. This will be a reference document that's available where you can go into your PDF viewer and zoom in and get that information that you want. Just wanted to let people know that this is available. And then so stepping back again and thinking about interties and where there are connections in the region that are pertinent for this group and helpful to understand better. We want to talk about that, but just before we do, just thinking about what are those barriers to interties and looking at these transmission lines. Obviously there's infrastructure in the region that can move water where people need it when they need it, but whether or not it can connect across service areas, there are certain boundaries that prohibit that and making those connections. So one would be pressure differentials. Making those connections depending on the pressure requires a different level of investment to make the movement of water possible. Fluoridation practices can limit that ability if one purveyor, one service area includes fluoride, the other one doesn't. The price of the water itself, if somebody's selling water and moving it across a service area, that price can be a limitation. The different quality constraints, limitations on the right or the contract and leaving like a point of use, or I can't think of the right phrase, but there's limitations on certain water going to certain places, and that's another constraint. And then just the infrastructure itself. So looking at this, there are pipes and connections and valves that allow movement across service areas, but there are these general constraints to keep in mind. So rather than trying to show you where each of these connections happen in the really physical sense, and wanting to recognize that water can be exchanged across purveyors without that physical infrastructure, going back to this kind of simple graphic showing where there are connections across service areas and purveyors are able to move water either one way or both ways, using this as that kind of overall informative piece of information so that you can, without maybe knowing exactly how PCWA and Roseville, what mechanism are they using to do that necessarily, but recognizing that they can move water between themselves one way or the other. And similarly with the city of Sacramento, able to exchange water with Sac Suburban. So this is where that connection comes in. They do have access to surface water. There is a connection through the city of Sacramento's transmission lines that allows movement to Sac Suburban and water from Sac Suburban to the city of Sac. And similarly with the city of Sac to Sac County, able to move water both directions. And this is just a list of some of those major transmission lines that allow for that movement of water across service areas. So the cooperative transmission pipeline, the ATP are two, I think, significant ones. Okay, yeah, that, you know, are a big part of the San Juan Consortium and how that water is moved, but then also include Caliam, Sac Suburban, as other entities that are able to use those transmission lines to access water. Another one is this connection between Carmichael and Golden State, which goes under the river, and then the Freeport line, which Max, you were looking at earlier, and that you're not necessarily pulling water directly off of the Freeport line, but that it is moved through that system and accessed through the Folsom South Canal. So this is just intended to be this, you know, this reference graphic that we can look to and get a sense of who's able to share water and who's able to move water across service areas.
Ashley, there's been some, I think,
I know, I'm
Jessica.
Tanya and I were about to say the same thing. Go ahead, Tanya.
Go ahead, Jessica. Okay, there's been some discussion in chat. First, I want to thank Marcus for indicating that Folsom State Prison is also a diverter, although small. But speaking to the maps in particular, Barbara asked if we could blow up the map, and that was that very, you know, small transmission line map, I believe. And Paul, and then Paul thank you, Paul, for putting a link there into the SharePoint. And as Jeff indicated, it is the goal to get everybody up on the SharePoint site, but many aren't there yet. So maybe just, Ashley, you could just speak to sort of the intentions of making this material more accessible and how people might be able to view it better, because the L&E committee had some good conversations about that.
Yes. So yeah, I think as we've been saying, the slide deck will be made available after we get all of the specific details verified. But then we are creating a resource library on SharePoint that will include all of the reference material, and this map being one of them. And we will work on getting everybody access to that. I think our hope and our expectation, and we're kind of looking at Jessica, is that maybe in the next 1 to 2 weeks, getting people lined up with that, just so they do have that as a reference. Does that sound right, Jessica?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much information that's packed in here. So SharePoint is a good resource. And Barbara, I saw your note about not having a work computer, and we'll I think we'll have some troubleshooting that we need to do for folks who are not, you know, who don't have Office 365 or Microsoft 365 sort of loaded and ready to go. But we can work with you on that. And then also this whole presentation obviously is being recorded, and we're going to try and get it up on the website as soon as possible.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
And sorry, one more thing. There's an actual hard copy version of this map up in our office. So our office, I know you're not there all the time, or everyone's not there all the time, but we do have some actual hard copy printouts in very large format.
And I would bring it up and show you what it looks like when you zoom in, but with my screen sharing I don't want to risk it going haywire again. I just tried to do it and it wouldn't let me click on anything. So. Rob?
Yes, a question on the diagram that showed the ability to move water from one district to another. Is it possible to put, and I don't see it there, it may be there, to identify the potential magnitude of the transfer of water in terms of what the maximum is by either capacity, a physical capacity, or by contractual agreement?
Yeah, when you were saying that, I just started picturing a way we could do that. I think it would be best in like a tabular form rather than trying to put it on the graph, like to accompany the graph, but we can think about ways to show that because I think that would be helpful.
It's all on that big monster map. So and yeah, the unfortunate situation is it's not one number. You know, there are multiple pathways that have different numbers. So this is a global sense, but yeah, there's some subtleties to it.
Yeah, and in terms of, I guess we could show kind of what they have been historically, what these exchanges of water have looked like historically or in recent history without, yeah, the capacity is trickier. Okay. Okay, so speaking of transfers, this map was really looking at the ability to move water within our region across the service areas. And the next slide is just trying to summarize the types of water transfers that happen that go outside of the region. It includes ones that are within the region as well, but looking at what types of transfers there are for people that are less familiar. So it can be groundwater substitution transfers, where a purveyor indicates and records that they're pumping more groundwater. And then foregoing their surface water rights, and then are able to sell or transfer that surface water to another entity. Reservoir operation, which is essentially releasing surplus storage out of the reservoirs and being able to move that outside of the region. And conserved water, providing a recorded measure that water has been conserved and is being made available for transfer outside of their service area. And then this is just a summary of transfers that have taken place with some of the key purveyors in the region and the quantities that they were. PCWA, we're waiting for input from them. Just wanted to make sure we didn't misrepresent anything, but generally they partake in reservoir reoperation transfers. And I think in the recent period, it's been anywhere from 15 to 20,000 acre feet of transfers outside of the region. I know, Tony, you're on. I don't know if you want to speak to that or not, but just providing this overall summary of what those transfers have looked like, who the players are, when they happened, and what the quantities are.
No, thank you, Ashley. That was good. I'm sorry we haven't gotten you the data yet.
No, it's okay. There was a lot that we put together, so we'll get it. I know we will. Chris?
Yeah, I'm just sorry if I missed. Can you explain why it's called reoperation? Thanks.
I'm gonna ask Jeff maybe, I don't know, or somebody else that's more familiar with what I understood it to be is that it is changing the timing of releases because of surplus storage and releasing additional water and moving it to another entity.
I'd clarify, it's not just a rescheduling of water. Technically transfer has to be kind of quote unquote new water. And so that would be pulling reservoirs down, and we got Brian and Tony here to both probably speak to this about their reservoir reoperation, but basically you can pull the reservoir down lower than you otherwise would have and demonstrate that water is being released.
That was characteristic of it. Yeah. And I'm no expert, but you have to prove in the following year that you have taken your reservoir down an amount equal to the transfer. And that's proven with like a refill agreement with the Department of Water Resources.
Thank you, Tony and Jeff. Does that help, Chris?
Yep, thanks.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, that is the end of the municipal water supply system summary. There will be the purveyor slides with details about their individual supply contracts and rights, their treatment facilities, demands, current and projected, that will be available with the slides, but rather than walking through that in detail for each purveyor, we weren't going to do that today. The next section is just looking at future plans for water supply reliability. It's a fairly short section, but just wanted to point to the water supply reliability plan that was developed in 2019. And this was a big collaborative regional effort that I believe RWA led, with a lot of input and coordination with the different purveyors, and looking at what plans they may have that would increase the reliability of the region's water supplies. That effort resulted in a really long and exhaustive list of plans that the purveyors might have, and they ranged from I'd say designed and ready to be implemented. Some were in the process of being implemented, others more conceptual. So the costs that are shown here, with that in mind, are conceptual in nature, but really breaking down those lists from the individual purveyors into categories and what the region has planned, from structural to non-structural, and thinking about ways that the region could improve that reliability of their supplies. The emphasis was on conjunctive use, and just like we've been talking about, the importance of that for both the health of the river and the sustainability of the groundwater basins. It's summarized here, and it's included as an appendix to that. The detailed list is included as an appendix to that water supply reliability report, which is available at that link. And within that detailed appendix, it has that level of design, completion, conceptual. It breaks it down. So the reason for focusing on it this way is that we recognize that each of the purveyors have different priorities and different plans in the pipeline that they're planning to deploy within their region. And rather than go through and cherry pick which ones we wanted to showing this as a reference for a really exhaustive effort that took place just a couple of years ago, and pointing people back to that as something to look to for more information. Tim?
Yeah, Ashley, I'm looking at the groundwater wells with the injection options for recharging the groundwater basin. Can you give some examples of what some of the actions would be? You list 95 number of actions that would take place with this plan. Can you give an example of some of those?
So I wasn't as involved with this. I was not involved in this effort. So I don't know if anybody on the call was more involved in it, but what comes to mind initially is like the city of Roseville, and any plans they might have for some of their ASR wells. What does that stand for? Artificial, I can't remember what ASR stands for.
Aquifer storage recharge.
Aquifer storage and recovery.
Recovery, there you go, sorry.
Thank you. So Brett, yeah, I know you were really involved in that process. Brett, do you want to provide some more examples?
Sure. I mean, I'm most knowledgeable, of course, about the city of Sacramento, ideas. For instance, we have, 30 odd groundwater wells that are ranging from 50 to 75 years old. We've really eked out as much useful life as we can. So in some cases, the newer wells might be rehabilitated. That would be an action. In other cases, we might be installing an entirely new replacement well in an advantageous location. So in some cases, the aquifer storage and recovery, they're geographically, some areas are, that's available. In other areas, for instance, like in the city of Sacramento area, you've got a lot of shallow groundwater levels, you got a lot of clay. So ASR may not be as viable, where in other areas such as Roseville, as they've shown, that's a very viable technique to manage the groundwater system.
Brett, since you have some knowledge, just a question, is it possible that installation of new wells, can those wells be dual purpose for drawing and recharge?
They can, and that's a case-by-case basis. When you hire a hydrogeologist, for instance, and you really look at the location, the question will be, is this viable? Right? Because installing a groundwater well that can also do storage is a more expensive piece of infrastructure. And in many cases, it's really driven by the condition, the subsurface conditions. many areas, I mean, I've looked at that in the city of Sacramento area, and most locations, it's not a very viable technique. And it's strictly because just, you worry about mounding of groundwater. In some cases we have, garages downtown, right, that are actually extracting water to keep from flooding the garages. But if there's an area that has deep ground, there's a lot of depth groundwater and there's a lot of gravel in that area, it will accept that. And so really it's driven, case by case. Another effort that the Regional Water Authority sponsored was to sort of geographically look, I wouldn't call it a business plan, but to ask where in this region is ASR, has the highest chances of success. So that's been a separate effort that came a little bit after this regional water reliability plan.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Brett. Brett, did you have your own comment or question?
Nope, I was just gonna
just
offer that up since you asked if anyone else was on the phone that was involved in the study.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, Paul.
So Brett just mentioned I think it's called a feasibility study that RWA did. Sacramento, others participated in it for aquifer storage and recovery. And it's a good report. I'll get that to you, Ashley, so you can add that to the SharePoint documentation. And maybe I'll also send a link to it. I don't know if it's on RWA's webpage. I know the Regional Water Reliability Plan, which is this excerpt here that's on the screen here, is on their webpage, and I'll put the link in the chat here in a second. So another good report was one that was just recently done for Citrus Heights Water District, because they're in the process of installing some aquifer storage and recovery wells, and wanted to know what the answers are to the questions that Brett just posed about where does the aquifer allow this type of operation to happen. You also have to think about the water quality, both in terms of the surface water that's being put into the aquifer and the quality of the water being taken out of the aquifer. So it's a host of things. And kudos to Roseville. They spent 10 years getting the Regional Water Board to allow them to do aquifer storage and recovery. So we really appreciate the work that they did to set us up for success here in the region. But this is one of the tools that water agencies throughout the region are going to be using to allow us to use the groundwater aquifer in a more robust manner than we've been able to do. And it's really part of the water bank that's in existence and will expand in the future.
Thanks, Paul. All right. Yep, and then I know I said this, the non-structural, just recognizing that includes this ability, the creating transfer agreements or groundwater banking, like these non-structural types of agreements and processes that would also improve water supply reliability. So again, the water reliability plan is included in the reference materials that will be sent, and then that appendix has more details about each of these individual types of actions. So just again, we've talked a lot about the references and the sources that were used. So this is just a really high level what the primary sources that were referenced in pulling this material together. So the American River Basin Integrated Regional Water Management Plan, 2020 Urban Water Management Plans, biological opinions of long-term operations for the CVP and SWP, the GSPs, and then what we just talked about, this Regional Water Reliability Plan. Here's the link to where that will be. So hopefully the timing of the release of these slides will coincide with the timing of your invitation to join the SharePoint. So that will all be made available. There's also a list of acronyms included, because I know that there were a lot. And that is the end of the presentation. Go ahead, Ted.
Thanks. I just thought that perhaps as part of your resources, a quick scan of the 3 GSPs might be useful. I think many of these projects are probably contained in the GSPs, but in their individual plans or considerations for future activity. But certainly those mentioned in the Kasumi's sub-basin may not be in what you have here.
The project specifically and their plans for the future.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Any other questions or comments? Clyde.
Yeah, I'd just like to congratulate you guys. You guys did a great job, you and Jeff and the rest of the team, but this is a very good presentation.
Oh, thanks, Clyde. Well, it was a team effort. Thank you.
Yeah, similarly, great job. I don't recall, because it was earlier in the presentation, if there was a side-by-side table that showed how much of the water that's coming into the system ends up staying here, used by purveyors and ag here in this region versus flows down into the delta and goes. I think there might have been, but if that doesn't exist, those side-by-side numbers would be really useful, you know, because of the capacity of Folsom is obviously obligated to far more than just local use. But thank you. It was a great job.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think that the content is in there. It's not necessarily side by side. So I think including that would be good. When we get the appendix slides, those reference slides, I think that could be something that's included there. Ted and Clyde, are those old hands? Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and just thank everybody.
All right, Ashley, Jeff, thank you so much. I know that, well, we're gonna put the recording up on the website, and I know I will be watching it over and over again. So thanks. All right, I'm gonna stop the recording.